Welcome, everyone. Give it a minute or so to let people sign on. All right. Go ahead and get started. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for the Museum of Medical History's virtual lecture series. Before we start, throughout the program, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat or the Q&A function, and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. So to introduce our speaker, I'd like to introduce Dr. Bob LePerriere. He's a retired dermatologist with Kaiser Permanente and the SSVMS Museum of Medical History's curator. So welcome, Dr. Bob.
Thank you, Sam, and welcome everybody, and thank you for attending one of our lectures again. Just a reminder that our Museum of Medical History is now open Tuesday through Friday. Reservations can be made on our website, ssvms.org/museum. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for the evening. Dr. Dillon Carroll is a history instructor at Butte College and also the author of Invisible Wounds, Mental Illness and Civil War Soldiers, that was published in 2021 by LSU Press. He is a resident of East Sacramento. This is his third lecture for our museum. He previously presented The Psychological Strain of Soldiering in November of 2021, and Every Man His Own Physician in June of 2022. Both of these are available to view on our museum's website under the Virtual Medical History Lecture Series link. Again, welcome to tonight's lecture, and I'd like to welcome and thank Dr. Carroll for joining us again. It's all yours, Dylan.
Thanks, Dr. Bob, and thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure for volunteering for the museum since I moved to Sacramento in 2018. A couple of quick disclaimers. Number one, if you hear what sounds like a baby crying, that's because we have a 4-month-old at home who does not like to go to sleep. And you might be hearing bedtime struggles right now. Number two, I am not a medical doctor. I'm a historian by training. So I'm going to be talking less about the pathophysiology of the plague and more about the history of the plague, and especially its social and political and technological effects. So disclaimers out of the way, let us begin. So we're going to be looking at the bubonic plague, or the Black Death of the 14th century, arguably the greatest health disaster in human history. It's important to point out that the plague was not exactly new, and there had been previous plague events prior to the Black Death of the 14th century. It was, for instance, perhaps plague that struck Athens in 430 BCE, known as the Plague of Athens. And it struck at a disastrous time for Athens when Athens was beginning its terrible war with Sparta, known as the Peloponnesian War. Perhaps it was plague, perhaps not. It was somewhat plague-like, as described by the Greek historian Thucydides, who wrote about it, quote, "In Attica, the plague first began to show itself among the Athenians. As a rule, however, there was no ostensible cause, but people in good health were all of a sudden attacked. Externally, the body was not very hot to the touch, nor pale in its appearance, but reddish, livid, and breaking out into small pustules and ulcers. In 541 of the Common Era, a disease epidemic spread in Byzantium, the eastern half of the Roman Empire. By then, the Roman Empire had collapsed, and the Byzantines called themselves the Romans. It was known as Justinian's plague, named after Emperor Justinian, and it was, by the descriptions of the Byzantine historian Procopius, probably bubonic plague. Procopius, who wrote about Justinian's plague, wrote, quote, "Pestilence spread through the whole known world, and notably the Roman Empire, wiping out most of the farming community and of necessity leaving a trail of desolation in its wake." And Procopius gives us a pretty detailed description of the plague and its victims, writing, quote, "Those who were attending were in a state of constant exhaustion and had a most difficult time of it throughout. The patients also had great difficulty in the matter of eating, for they could not easily take food, and many perished through lack of any man to care for them. For they were either overcome by hunger or threw themselves down from a height. Death came in some cases immediately, in other cases days, and with some the body broke out with black pustules about as large as a lentil, and these did not survive even one day, but all succumbed immediately." What is plague? Plague is caused by a rod-shaped bacterium called Yersinia pestis. Yersinia pestis was first isolated and identified in the wake of an 1894 plague epidemic in Hong Kong. It was isolated and identified first by Alexandra Yersin, who the bacteria is named after. Japanese bacteriologist Kitasato Shibasaburo also independently isolated and identified the bacteria in the 1894 Hong Kong epidemic as well. There are, it's worth mentioning, several forms of plague. The most common, the one that we believe caused the Black Death of the 14th century, is known as bubonic plague, named for what were called the bubos, the lesions or growths that was often identified with the plague. It was characterized by these large egg-shaped tumors, which would usually manifest in the armpits, neck, and legs. And if left unchecked, can have somewhere between a 30 to 60% mortality rate. There's also pneumonic plague, which is a droplet infection of plague. And if left unchecked, can be extremely deadly, with mortality rates ranging from 30 to even 100%. And the final form of plague, and perhaps the most feared, is septicemic plague, which, like pneumonic plague, if left unchecked, can have somewhere between a 30 to 100% mortality rate. How is plague spread? The vector of the plague is the flea. The flea prefers rodents like rats, but will feed on humans if there's no other source. The plague infects a flea and grows in its foregut, creating a blockage. And this artificially makes the flea incredibly hungry and turns it into a living hypodermic needle. Every bite the flea gives, every bite an infected flea gives, injects the host with a dose of bacteria. And the rat flea, as its name suggests, does not prefer humans, so it will feed on humans. But its preference is rats and rodents. And in this case, the black rat, what was once called the Oriental black rat, is believed to be the culprit for the spread of the plague throughout the world. Black rats are remarkable little critters. They are incredible breeders. 2 rats in 3 years can produce over 400 offspring. And if left unchecked, the offspring of those 2 rats can ultimately produce 329 million more offspring in 3 years. So they are just virulent breeders. They are also incredibly agile. They can leap almost 3 feet. They can survive falls from a height of 50 feet. They can climb almost any surface and squeeze through openings as small as 1/4 inch. So they can get anywhere. They are hard to kill, and they are the flea's preferred host. It's worth mentioning that not all historians agree that the bubonic plague was the cause of the Black Death of the 14th century. And there are a number of controversies about plague and the Black Death. For instance, fleas prefer rats, and they would jump over to humans in large numbers, large enough to cause some sort of disease epidemic like the Black Death if there was a massive rat die-off. But there doesn't seem to be any convincing evidence of a big rat die-off. And if there was this, sort of huge event that killed a bunch of black rats, people at the time probably would have written about it. We don't have evidence of that. Maybe that evidence has been lost. We don't know. It's a bit of a controversy. Some historians have suggested the Black Death was actually not plague, but something else. And that comes from eyewitness evidence of people who lived through the plague wrote. And they describe some symptoms that don't exactly track with plague. One of which is malodorousness, or an intense stench. Another is delirious agitation, some kind of nervous or neurological issue, not always associated with plague. And this leads us to maybe think that maybe there was some sort of mutation of plague going on here. This could have been a mutated form of plague, maybe something novel, some kind of disease that we've never seen before or since. It could have been a viral infection. So there are some controversies and some gray areas here that are worth acknowledging. But the established wisdom on the Black Death is that it was caused by bubonic plague. And so that's the story we're going to tell today. Plague is not new, as I suggested at the beginning. And so what happened in the 14th century that led to this massive disease epidemic? And to really understand that, we have to roll back the clock several hundred years to about 1209, when in 1209 of the Common Era, the Mongols, a nomadic horse warrior people from the grasslands of Central Asia, began a conquest of Eurasia not seen since Alexander the Great. In brief, why? Why did the Mongols spread out from Central Asia and conquer much of Eurasia during this period? Likely ecological changes may have resulted in less grass in Central Asia, and the Mongols may have ventured out in search of better pasture. In addition, trade changes. The Jin and Xia dynasties in North and Northwest China reduced their trade with the Mongols at this time, perhaps prompting their expansion. And finally, and maybe most importantly, in 1206, Temujin, an extremely charismatic Mongolian leader, was declared Chinggis Khan, or the Great Ruler. And he believed the Mongolian sky god had blessed him with a personal mission to bring the world under one sword. Between 1209 and 1259 of the Common Era, Chinggis and later his grandson Kublai conquered much of the known world in Eurasia. And one of the results of the Mongolian conquest was free trade. Prior to the 1200s, the Silk Road, the great ancient highway that connected east to west, was controlled by Persian and Turkish traders. And they charged a tax or a toll on the Silk Road for travel. The Mongols swept them out of power, and they were big fans of free trade and established free trade on the Silk Road. And it was now much easier for traders to carry goods across the Silk Road. And traveling on the Silk Road was goods, weapons, ideas, religions, and disease. The first recorded occurrence of the plague epidemic was in Issyk Kol, the Great Lake on the Silk Road. It next struck Kaffa, a Genoan trading city on the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea. From there, it progressed to Constantinople, now called Istanbul, and then to Sicily, and then it burned through Italy and into France, and then into England. It then made a great wheeling circle, coming back to Russia and the steppes of Central Asia from which it emerged. And this is a nice color-coded map that shows us the progression of the plague from 1347 to 1351. And it kind of makes a big, giant left hook over several years. It hit Europeans who were perhaps especially vulnerable to a disease epidemic at that time. The climate began to warm, and this prompted economic and population growth. Between 1000 and 1250 of the Common Era, we think the population of Europe doubled. And by about 1250, the population was pushing resources beyond what they could produce. In 1316, heavy rains and flooding destroyed harvests for that year, and an enormous famine followed. And so likely many Europeans were perhaps still malnourished by the time the plague struck, making them uniquely vulnerable. What did this look like? I'm going to rely a lot on Giovanni Boccaccio and his great Decameron, which describes the Black Death and the plague epidemic. And Boccaccio gave a wonderful description of the first emergence of plague symptoms, writing, quote, "In men and women alike, it first betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumors in the groin or armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg. From the two said parts of the body, this deadly gavacciolo soon began to propagate and spread itself in all different directions indifferently. After which the form of the malady began to change, black spots or livid making their appearance in many cases on the arm or the thigh or elsewhere, now few and large, now minute and numerous, as the gavacciolo had been and still was an infallible token of approaching death, such also were these spots on whomsoever they showed themselves." This is a portrait of several plague, presumably victims at the time. And you can see these tumors all over their bodies. Presumably these are a husband and wife. Doctors were virtually powerless to stop the progression of the plague, much less cure it. Their only real power was diagnosis. And it's worth thinking about some of the short-term responses. What were Europeans' short-term responses to the bubonic plague? There were several. They included what we might call social anarchy, religious responses, and anti-Semitic violence. So let's jump into these in more detail. The social anarchy of the plague is also greatly described by Giovanni Boccaccio. At the height of the epidemic in certain areas of Europe, social order teeters and threatened to break down. Charities were overwhelmed. Doctors refused to visit the sick. Priests refused to visit the dying. Rulers and the rich left the city. Boccaccio, who witnessed the plague in Florence, wrote, quote, "Tedious were it to recount how citizen avoided citizen, how among neighbors was scarce found any that shared fellow feeling for another, how kinsfolk held aloof and never met, or but rarely, enough that this sore affliction entered so deep into the minds of men and women that, in the horror thereof, brother was forsaken by brother, nephew by uncle, brother by sister, and oftentimes husband by wife. Nay, what is more and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited, to their fate as if they had been strangers. It's possible Boccaccio is exaggerating a little bit here, but we can get a real sense of social order breaking down at the height of the plague epidemic in certain quarters of Europe. And it's somewhat reminiscent, I think, of the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we didn't, quite know what was going on, and people, walking outside were staying 6 feet away from each other, trying to avoid contact. In Siena, Agnolo di Turca, an ambitious businessman, kept a journal during the Black Death there. And one entry described the challenges that the mass death of the plague created. And in this case, Agnolo di Turca described the death pits created to bury all the bodies. Quote, in many parts of Siena, very wide trenches were made, and in these they placed the bodies, throwing them in and covering them with but a little dirt. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could without a priest, without divine offices. Some of the dead were so ill covered that the dogs dragged them forth and devoured the many bodies throughout the city. This is a contemporary portrait of, one of these death pits of people showing up to bury bodies. And perhaps somewhat tragically, a lot of the depictions here seem to be perhaps parents burying children, which is a kind of uniquely tragic part of this plague. And it certainly also, reminded me of the early days at the height of the coronavirus pandemic. And, in 2020, in the spring, I was reading about mobile morgues as funeral homes were being overwhelmed. This year, China had a similar instance, and there was news reports about crematoriums being overwhelmed in China. Tragically, for Agnolo di Turca, in the Plaza de Campo, he and his wife had used to take their children for visits, and it was now marred by a death pit. And the concluding sentence of his journal in 1348 was heartbreakingly, quote, and I, Agnolo di Turca, called the fat, buried my wife and 5 children with my own hands. How do people react to the plague that was ravaging Europe? Boccaccio also gives us several wonderful groups of reactions, and these I think will seem also somewhat reminiscent. One response was isolation from society. Boccaccio described this group, writing, quote, some people were of the opinion that a sober and abstemious mode of living considerably reduced the risk of infection. They therefore formed themselves into groups and lived in isolation from everyone. Having withdrawn to a comfortable abode, they locked themselves in and settled down to a peaceable existence, consuming modest quantities of delicate food and precious wines, and avoiding all excesses. And this might, of course, sound a little bit familiar from our own recent COVID-19 pandemic, where maybe you or maybe some people reacted this way. Another response Boccaccio described was perhaps the opposite. People who rejected any measures. He describes them as, quote, others took the opposite view and maintained that an infallible way to ward off this appalling evil was to drink heavily, enjoy life to the full, gratifying all of one's cravings, and shrug the whole thing off as one enormous joke. Members of this group visited one tavern after the other, drinking all day and night to immoderate excess, or they would do their drinking in various private houses, but only in ones where the conversation was restricted to subjects that were entertaining or pleasant. People behaved as though their days were numbered and treated their belongings and own persons with abandon. And certainly, maybe some of us, or we know people who reacted this way as well to our more modern pandemic. When plague again struck Europe several hundred years later, as it did occasionally, Martin Luther, the great German theologian, wrote about this last group somewhat critically. criticizing people who ignored the plague, who seemed to be almost tempting fate. He wrote, Luther, quote, "They are much too rash and reckless, tempting God and disregarding everything which might counteract death and the plague. They disdain the use of medicines. They do not avoid places and persons infected by the plague, but lightheartedly make sport of it and wish to prove how independent they are. They say that it is God's punishment. If he wants to protect them, he can do so without medicines or our carefulness. This is not trusting God, but tempting him. God has created medicines and provided us with intelligence to guard and take good care of the body so that we can live in good health. Actually, that would be suicide. It is even more shameful for a person to pay no heed to his own body and to fail to protect it against the plague the best he is able, and then to infect and poison others who might have remained alive if he had taken care of his body as he should have. He is thus responsible before God for his neighbor's death and is a murderer many times over." And we've seen this kind of reaction as well, especially with evangelicals who stayed away from any sort of social distancing or protections and claimed that God would protect them. And for some, it's the COVID-19 pandemic has hit them pretty hard. Another short-term reaction was religious coping. All kinds of people, of course, turned to religion, but one extreme group that turned to a radical form of religious worship to cope with the terror of the plague, and perhaps the most well-known is the flagellants. In Germany, the Brotherhood of the Flagellants traveled from town to town, carrying out public spectacles of self-punishment and mutilation, similar to the punishment Jesus Christ had endured before his execution. And the idea behind this was society had become so sinful that they were going to redeem it through the sufferings, the self-punishments and sufferings that Christ had endured to redeem mankind. Flagellants would whip themselves with a heavy scourge, which was 3 or 4 leather tongs tipped with metal studs. Flagellations would be carried out 2, maybe even 3 times a day. And it was not uncommon for members of the flagellants to literally self-punish themselves to death. One witness gave a great description of the flagellants, writing, quote, "They moved in a long crocodile 2 by 2, usually in groups of 200 to 300, but occasionally even 1,000 strong. Men and women were segregated, the women taking their places towards the rear. At the head marched the group master and 2 lieutenants, carrying banners of purple velvet and cloth of gold. Except for occasional hymns, the marchers were silent, their heads and faces hidden in cowls, their eyes fixed on the ground. They were dressed in somber clothes with red crosses on back, front, and cap." And this is a contemporary portrait of a group of flagellants. And flagellants were more than a public spectacle. They were at times a menace. They raged against church corruption. They were fiercely anti-clerical, disrupting Catholic masses, driving priests from churches, and looting church property. And another short-term response was scapegoating. And in this case, the scapegoat for many Europeans were Jews. And many Europeans blamed Jews for the Black Death, or the bubonic plague, suggesting Jews had poisoned the wells of European villages and towns. This, of course, was not true. Some recent historians have suggested Jews had lower mortality rates during the plague due to practices of ritual purity in Judaism. There's no way to know if that's true for sure. But regardless, in many parts of Europe, Jews were blamed for the plague, and anti-Semitic violence broke out, mostly in Central Europe, in modern-day Germany, Austria, Switzerland, that area, but not exclusively to Central Europe. Jacob von Königshofen at the time described such violence against Jews, quote, "In many cities, once expelled, they were caught by the peasants and stabbed to death or drowned. Women with their small children cruelly and inhumanely fed to the flames." And perhaps the worst anti-Semitic violence took place at Mons, where an estimated 6,000 German Jews were killed by the townspeople. Some died horribly in a mass suicide event, setting fire to their homes while trapped inside, rather than suffer at the hands of the mob. And this is a woodcut of this slaughter at Mons, depicting German Jews dying in the flames. Scapegoating for disease epidemics or pandemics is not new, and nor has it entirely disappeared. Hundreds of years later, Chinese immigrants to America were the scapegoats of plague outbreaks in places like San Francisco. Virulently racist tropes of the 19th and 20th centuries held that Asians were more susceptible to plague, called by some at the time a disease of rice eaters. In the 1880s, The Wasp, a magazine here, published a racist cartoon depicting a Chinese immigrant as a pseudo Statue of Liberty figure in San Francisco Bay. And associated with this figure was filth and disease, which was how many Americans saw Chinese immigrants at the time. In 1899, plague appeared in Honolulu, Hawaii, and residents of Oahu descended on Honolulu and burned Honolulu's Chinatown to the ground, blaming its Chinese residents for the spread of plague in Honolulu. The next year, plague arrived in San Francisco. And in response, the medical authorities in San Francisco quarantined the entire Chinatown district, erecting barbed wire fences around the district. But excluded from the quarantine were white residents and white-owned businesses, as it was believed Asians were uniquely susceptible to the plague in a way that white Americans were not. Of course, that was not true. And in 1906, after San Francisco was devastated by a disastrous earthquake, plague emerged once again, and this time infecting mostly white residents of San Francisco. And people began to realize this was not a disease that made a racial distinction. And of course, recently, there's been a spate of anti-Asian harassment and violence in response to the coronavirus epidemic, as Asians seem to be once again the scapegoats for coronavirus. Winding back to the Black Death plague epidemic, what were the consequences of the Black Death of the 14th century? An estimated 200 million people may have died worldwide. There's no way to know this with complete accuracy, but most historians agree that about somewhere around 200 million Europeans may have died from the plague. To give you a sense of the scale of this consequence, an equivalent number of deaths from a disease epidemic today would be 1.9 billion. So that gives you a sense of the scale of the disastrous nature of the Black Death epidemic. The best estimate for European mortality rates as well is somewhere around, we think, 30% of the population. Between 1347, when plague first appeared in Sicily, and 1352, when it reached Moscow, it may have killed 25 million people out of a total estimated population of 75 million. So maybe as much or more than 30% of Europe may have died. What were the consequences of this? They were vast and fascinating. Beyond the human toll, the human consequences, the vast death created by the bubonic plague created massive labor shortages in Europe that would ironically improve the fortunes of the survivors. And those labor shortages also resulted in technological innovations that would meet the demand for labor during this period of shortage. So let's dive into this a little bit. We'll start first with peasants and serfs. Peasants and serfs benefited from this post-plague labor shortage in Europe. And they were able to benefit from this by being able to negotiate. Lords and landlords needed their labor, and labor was now in demand. So peasants and serfs were able in many places to negotiate lower fees for labor. Peasants had to spend a portion of their time working the lord's land. Many of them were able to negotiate lower amounts of this kind of labor. Other peasants were able to negotiate with their lords or landlords on things like oxen and seeds being provided either at a discount or free of charge. And essentially more capital began to go to the working class. Many peasants benefited from this by leaving the hinterlands and moving to towns and cities and being able to move into urban labor. And ultimately, in some places, not all, in some places, this was the beginning of the end of serfdom. It doesn't die immediately, and in many places like France, it continues on for several hundred more years. But it is the writings on the wall for serfdom here. It's the beginning of the end in many places. Related to this, other changes were afoot, and some lords and landlords, finding it difficult to get or keep peasants to work the land, began to convert their land to pasture and started, instead of farming it, to raise sheep herds for wool. This involved much less labor and much less expense, and was the beginning of what we call the enclosure movement, starting first in England and then spreading to other parts of Europe. And producing wool for the market is a step on the way to a market economy rather than an agricultural subsistence economy. And so this doesn't happen at once. It's kind of a slow halting thing, but changes are afoot in Europe's economic structure here. Let's shift to artisans and craftsmen. In most medieval European cities and towns and urban centers, artisans and craft guilds were the gatekeepers to working in a craft or artisan profession. You had to have the stamp of the guild in order to get work, to be a carpenter, for instance. After the plague, post-plague, there's this labor shortage and there's less artisans and craftsmen, but there's more demand. And so by necessity, craft guilds began to become more accessible. For instance, in one guild in Florence, the Guild of Silk Merchants, before the plague, the Black Death, about half of guild members had got in because of family connection. After the plague pandemic, only about 30% of guild members had gotten into the Guild of Silk Merchants by family connections. So people without family connections after the plague had better opportunities for guild membership and thus better opportunities for access to artisan and craftsman trades. For all you Marvel Comics fans out there, if you wanted to make a case for the Thanos snap, this is it. Survivors of the plague were generally living better lives than they were before the plague. And we can measure this in some places. For instance, in England, in 1347, the average wage of a carpenter was £3. 20 years later, the average wage for carpenters had nearly doubled to £5. So the survivors of the plague generally, not all, but generally were living better lives, making more money, having more disposable income. More capital was flowing to the middle class and the working class, really than ever before. This was not welcome in many places. For instance, England kind of tried to put the genie back in the bottle. In 1351, they passed the Statute of Laborers, and that statute read, quote, "It was lately ordained by our Lord King with the assent of the prelates, nobles, and others of his council against the malice of employees who were idle and were not willing to take employment after the pestilence unless for outrageous wages, that such employees, both men and women, should be obliged to take employment for the salary and wages accustomed to be paid in the place where they were working in the 20th year of the king's reign, which in this case was 1346, or 5 or 6 years earlier. And that if the same employees refuse to accept employment in such a manner, they should be punished by imprisonment, as is more clearly contained in the said ordinance. Essentially, England was trying to force laborers to accept pre-plague wages and to put the genie back in the bottle and pretend that this whole thing had never happened. It was mostly ignored, and the dictates of the market were more powerful than a statute in this case. And we've seen sort of changes in the labor market in our own time after the COVID-19 pandemic, as there's been a remarkable number of fluxes and changes in our own labor market. So very similar, though not the same, of course. As a result, Europeans had more money in their pockets, and they had more money to spend on luxury goods. And class distinctions began to become a little fuzzier, a little more gray. And paranoid aristocrats passed things like sumptuary legislation, which forbade the wearing of certain articles of clothing or colors by this nouveau riche, this new middle class emerging post-plague. Essentially, the elite and the aristocrats were trying to more strongly establish their class, to make it apparent who was an aristocrat and who wasn't, because a new number of new middle class Europeans were able to afford luxury goods in the wake of the plague. There's some anecdotal and suggestive evidence that perhaps women's lives and fortune survivors were improved by the plague as well. This is just suggestive. We don't know this for certain. But according to church records, the average age of women who married in 1347 was 21.4 years of age. Decades later, after the plague in the 1360s, the average age of women who had married had increased to 24.6 years of age. This is only anecdotal and suggestive, but perhaps it indicates that women were putting off marriage or could afford to be more selective, all of which perhaps hints that women's lives had improved in the wake of the plague. You'll see here, interestingly, that men's average age of marriage had decreased. And that suggests perhaps that women's increased selectiveness for mates meant that men could not wait as long for marriage. Perhaps there was a gender imbalance. We know, for instance, that today men were more likely to die of COVID-19 than women. Perhaps there was a similar dynamic with the plague, and there was a gender imbalance, more women than men, and women could afford to be choosy while men could not. All of this is just suggestive. There's no way to know for sure, but it's possible that in the wake of the plague, European women's lives were improved in some small way. All this leads to technological changes. There were huge technological changes in the wake of the plague. Some historians argue the labor shortages after the Black Death led to a host of labor-saving technologies, and one such innovation was printing. Prior to the plague, if you wanted a book, like the Bible, for instance, you paid someone to hand copy it for you. And this, for instance, were people hand copying a print. This made books heavily expensive because they were labor intensive, and only the very rich could afford access to books. In the wake of the plague and this ensuing labor shortage, there were either not enough people to hand copy books or not enough people willing to hand copy books anymore, or both. And there was this shortage of labor, which led to a technological innovation to meet demand, and that was the printing press. The innovations that led to the printing press followed the Black Death and replaced the practice of hand copying books. The effects of the printing press, of course, are enormous. It's the printing press that facilitates the scientific revolution and the later Enlightenment and the Age of Exploration. Literacy soon follows because, for a scientific revolution and an enlightenment, you need both access to books and literacy. Not exactly related to the plague, but literacy ironically followed with the Protestant Reformation, when in 1517, the German theologian Martin Luther nailed his critique of the Catholic Church, the 95 Theses, to the door of the Wittenberg Church. And one of Luther's main arguments was that central to being a good Christian was the ability to read and understand the Bible for oneself. He said, quote, "Let the man who would hear God speak read Holy Scriptures." And in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, literacy rates increased. This is hard to measure everywhere, of course, because of the lack of evidence. We do know that in Amsterdam in 1680, only about 44% of Amsterdam residents were literate. 100 years later, that had grown to 64% of Amsterdam residents who could read. And the widespread availability of printed books, combined with increasing literacy rates, made something like the scientific revolution possible. In 1543, for instance, Nicholas Copernicus, pictured here, published Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, arguing that our galaxy was heliocentric or sun-centered and not Earth-centered, as previous philosophers such as Aristotle and Ptolemy had proposed. Before the plague, such a proposition would have likely been buried by academic elites, wedded to Ptolemaic or Aristotelian philosophy, or buried by church authorities who viewed such an argument as an implicit critique of biblical worldviews. But now, due to the widespread availability of printed books and the slowly growing literacy rates, people could read and judge for themselves. And many later scholars did just that. People like Galileo and Newton were people who read Nicholas Copernicus's argument, were convinced, and soon made their own advancements. The plague also makes the age of exploration possible. Europeans, as we mentioned before, were now flush with newfound disposable income, and they wanted to spend it on luxury goods. And one such luxury good, besides nice clothing, was spices. Nothing made life better than spicing up, for instance, bland English cuisine. New maritime technology allowed ships to be outfitted with smaller crews, an innovation that was created in the wake of the plague. There were better firearms that, in the wake of the plague, replaced peasant soldiers. So you could have a smaller, more heavily armed crew. And European traders, however, grew frustrated by the tolls and taxes that had been reestablished by Muslim powers on the Silk Road. And they sought to find a possible alternative to the spice markets of India and China. And they sought a back door to get cheaper pepper and nutmeg and cloves and ginger. And some Europeans began to look for a possible alternative route to the spice markets of India and China, such as Prince Henry the Navigator, the great Portuguese explorer, and his great admirer, Christopher Columbus, who thought he had found an alternative route to India. He, of course, discovered something different. And all these were huge innovations that likely would have happened without the plague, but certainly wouldn't have happened on the timeline we know without the plague. I hope you enjoyed this, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting.
Oh, good.
I know we have a question down here. I don't know if you can see the Q&A or not. Me here. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you for the alert. So how did the papacy react to the plague? I'm not a papal expert, so I don't know how the Pope or how the Vatican reacted to the plague. I do know that the Catholic Church got a bad rap. There were, lewd stories of priests abandoning their posts during the height of the plague and abandoning plague victims. But so the church got kind of a bad rap. But some researchers have shown that these were probably the minority or a plurality, and in fact, probably many priests, served admirably. For instance, there's some records that indicate priests had a 45% mortality rate from the plague, indicating they died in huge numbers, probably, ministering death rites to victims. And so, the church reaction is kind of mixed. There's some evidence in the wake of the plague that people turn away from religion and turn towards new alternative theories. Some have suggested, the European population is open to the Enlightenment in the wake of the plague. I'm not so sure of that because the Enlightenment is several hundred years down the road. There is some evidence there's kind of an immediate, maybe more religious reaction to the plague, one of which is we see more Christian birth names in the wake of the plague. So names like Llewellyn and Connor get replaced in increasing numbers by Michael and Gabriel and Noah and biblical names. So perhaps that suggests people were, turning more towards religion, but we can't say for sure.
All right. Oh, we have questions coming in. Do you want me to read them off, or do you want to pop up the Q&A on your end?
Q&A. Were any parts of Europe relatively immune to the plague? As far as I know, no. There were parts of Europe that did better for various reasons. But to my knowledge, there were not parts of Europe that were relatively immune to the plague. There were parts where we don't have reliable information and data, of course, because the 14th century was not great for records. So we don't have a ton of information or evidence or data. So there could be parts that did really well and we just don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Do you predict an increasing number of plagues? No, I mean, plague is controllable by penicillin. It's a bacteria. So unless there's a plague, a penicillin-resistant plague, then we're in trouble. But right now, if you get plague, which occasionally people do get plague, there was a plague warning in Tahoe a year or two ago, I remember, which is kind of funny. But if you get it, you will likely survive. I think the greatest fear of most epidemiologists is influenza right now, and especially bird flu, that there's a particularly virulent strain and deadly strain that hasn't, thankfully, been able to jump into the human population and infect people efficiently. But of course, influenza and viruses are mutating all the time, so that might change, hopefully not, but yeah. Was plague contagious, or did infected people have to be bitten by fleas to contract? Good question. Yeah, plague is contagious. Bubonic plague is spread by fleas. So people who were bitten by fleas contracted bubonic plague. But the pneumonic and septicemic plagues are passed by droplet infection, so sneezing can pass it. We don't know exactly which form of plague was responsible for the Black Death. Most people think bubonic, but like I said at the outset, there is a lot of gray area here, a lot of questions, and nothing approaching certainty.
We have one question in the chat here.
Okay.
Any pseudoscientific cures popular back in the day?
Definitely. You know, in China, ginger was a popular cure or pseudoscientific cure, although ginger does have some good benefits. Bleeding was in vogue still at the time. And that, I guess, wasn't pseudoscientific at the time, that was scientific, but pseudoscience to us. So yeah, there were a number of responses. Didn't the same sort of transformations and innovations take place after the 30 Years' War, which wiped out a lot of the European population? Yeah, I think, you know, the Enlightenment, and especially the political Enlightenment, you know, people like John Locke and others, Baron de Montesquieu and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, they're all, you know, writing these new political Enlightenment theories in the wake of the 30 Years' War. And people there's new ideas and new innovations in the wake of that. Yeah, and that has been said before, you know, disease and war are often the handmaidens of revolution. And some of the biggest innovations are in the wake of disease epidemics or in the wake of war, ironically. What approximately was the average percentage of plague deaths in the population of Europe? We think about 30% of the European population died of the plague. That's an estimate. We don't know that for sure. We don't know the average age, and I don't know if that's what you were hinting at there. But we don't know the average age, which would be interesting. You know, something like the Spanish influenza of 1918, 1919 mostly targeted young people between, you know, 10 years of age and 30. So that was kind of a weird, virulent form of influenza that targeted normally healthy people. So we don't know. It'd be really interesting to know the answer, but I don't know that. Great questions. So responses.
We have one more in the chat here. Are you aware of any treatments that were tried by physicians or other healthcare providers, or efforts to determine cause at that time in the 1350 era?
Great question. I don't know of any treatments that were maybe successful, if that's your question. And I mean, like I said, bleeding was a common practice, and people experimented with a number of things. I'm again not totally aware of the scope of all those, but yeah, that's a great question.
Just one comment in the chat that people might be interested in. Someone mentioned they just read a new book called The Wool Translator, set in the time of new printing of books, the wool trade in Europe, and the beginning of Columbus's voyages.
There's another question. If it wasn't bubonic plague, can you speculate as to what else it could have been? Yeah, it could have been a mutated form of plague that maybe we haven't seen before or since. It could have been a viral infection that maybe, you know, again, you know, mutated and became something less deadly. So there's a number of theories out there. We don't know exactly. It could have been a number of things. It could have been bubonic plague combined with a viral infection, combined with something else. We don't know for sure, which makes me wary of, I read stories about scientists reviving old viruses and bacteria that have been trapped in ice for hundreds of years. Like, please don't do that. we're gonna reawaken, you know, something incredibly virile we've never seen before. I sometimes think these people don't watch science fiction, but whatever. Great questions.
All right. I think we're at time here.
You know, notice one more question just came in. Who is the first formal historian of the plague?
Oh, that's a great question. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. I'm gonna have to go to my notes. It's gonna kill me. I'm sorry, I can't recall the name off the top of my head. I'll have to send that. I'll have to send that to you, Dr. Bob, and maybe you can send it out.
Okay.
I'll have to go into my notes. Great question.
Okay.
I think that's
Oh,
it.
wait,
That's
one
a
more.
great
One more
comment.
popped in here. Does plague burn itself out?
You know, as I said at the outset, my second disclaimer, I'm not a medical doctor, so I shouldn't speculate on, you know, how plague epidemics end. My sense is that, you know, they run out of victims, or the fleas and rats that propagate the plague either move or get eradicated or die. And that's usually how epidemics end. That's my sense. But again, I'm not a medical doctor, so I'm not an expert on that.
Do we have time for the last question, Sam? What's interesting is a parallel outcome post-pandemic politically, financially, and socially. Do you think our politicians and medical experts look to history to foresee future events? Jeez.
Yeah, I was struck, you know, putting this together, just how many interesting, relevant parallels there were. Yeah, unfortunately, no, I don't think unfortunately our leaders look to history as much as they should, because in many cases, you know, history can be a blueprint, and in this case, you know, we could have, you know, perhaps maybe had a sense of where things were going with a better understanding of past disease epidemics like the plague. You know, and it's a great quote from Mark Twain that I love, that Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And if you're literate in history, you can sometimes begin to see some of the rhythms and kind of get a sense of where things might be going.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This was wonderful. We really appreciate you sharing all this knowledge. This was great.
My pleasure.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
And if anyone has people they'd like to recommend for future lectures, please let us know.
Thank you, everyone.
I have some recs. I'll send them your way.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you very much.